The rain in Manhattan doesn't wash away sins. It only makes the blood run faster. Imagine you're blocks away from the most prestigious gala in the city. You're wearing a red velvet dress that took you 3 months to sew by hand, a symbol of your future as a designer. You take a wrong turn to avoid a puddle, and suddenly, you aren't looking at a shortcut. You're looking at a man holding a warm pistol, standing over a body that was alive 60 seconds ago. This is the moment Tahlia Monroe's life ended, and the moment Kyung-min Hwang decided he wasn't going to let her leave. If you believe that the most dangerous men are often the ones who have simply never been given a reason to be soft, hit that like button, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe to the channel for more stories. Let's dive into why the monster of Manhattan chose to keep the only person who could send him to prison. The world has gone hauntingly silent. The only sound is the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of rain hitting the pavement and the distant, muffled wail of sirens that feel a lifetime away. Standing in the center of the alley is Kyung-min Hwang, the head of the city's most feared Korean syndicate. He is a statue of tailored silk and ink, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering neon of a broken sign nearby. He should have ended Tahlia the moment she turned that corner. It's the protocol. It's the rule. But as Tahlia stands there, trembling in her soaked velvet, her eyes aren't filled with the begging plea he's used to seeing. They are filled with a fierce, burning defiance. Instead of pulling the trigger, Kyung-min steps forward, his hand clamping firmly around her waist. He doesn't just hold her, he claims her. As he leans in, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder filling her senses, he whispers the 4 words that will change her destiny. "You're coming with me." The transition from the chaos of the alleyway to the interior of Kyung-min's estate was a blur of tinted glass and high-performance engines. One moment, Tahlia was shivering against the rough brick of a dead-end street. The next, she was being ushered through a subterranean garage that gleamed with the clinical precision of a surgical suite. The heavy thud of the armored SUV door closing behind her felt like the final gavel of a sentence. As Kyung-min led her into the private elevator, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of descending machinery. Tahlia stole a glance at him in the mirrored walls. He hadn't loosened his grip on her waist until they were behind the first set of biometric gates. Now, he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. The neon lights of the street were gone, replaced by the warm, recessed glow of a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. When the doors opened, she stepped out onto polished marble that reflected the sprawling, indifferent lights of the Manhattan skyline. The estate was a masterpiece of glass and steel, perched so high above the city that the sirens and the rain were nothing more than a memory. It was beautiful, but as Tahlia looked at the reinforced windows and the silent, suit-clad men stationed at every exit, a cold realization settled in her chest. Kyung-min had told her she was safe, and in a literal sense he wasn't lying. No rival gunman could penetrate these walls, but as she stood in the center of the vast, open living room, still wearing her soaked red velvet dress, looking like a drop of blood on a white canvas, she realized the true nature of her sanctuary. This wasn't a prison of bars and chains, it was a fortress of luxury. Kyung-min finally turned to face her, his silhouette framed by the billion-dollar view. He didn't offer an apology for the kidnapping or an explanation for the murder she had witnessed. He simply gestured to a hallway lined with white oak. "Your belongings will be sent for. My staff will provide whatever you need. But from this moment, Tahlia, you do not exist to the outside world. You do not call, you do not post, and you certainly do not leave." She opened her mouth to protest, to scream that she had a life, a thesis to finish, a future that didn't involve him. But the words died in her throat as he took a single step closer. The air between them hummed with that same dangerous electricity from the alley. He wasn't just protecting her from his enemies, he was sequestering her from her own life. She was safe, yes, but in this gilded cage, her voice was the first thing he had taken from her. The first 3 days were a battle of wills waged in absolute silence. Kyung-min had provided everything a person could technically need. Silk sheets, a bathroom stocked with imported oils, and 3-course meals delivered by a silver-haired chef who moved like a ghost. But the gourmet trays sat untouched on the marble countertop, the steam from the Wagyu beef vanishing into the filtered air of the penthouse. Tahlia didn't want his charity, and she certainly didn't want his silence. On the fourth morning, Kyung-min entered the dining suite to find her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her back to him. She was no longer wearing the ruined red velvet dress. She had scavenged a pair of oversized black sweatpants and a t-shirt from a guest room, her hair tied back in a tight, no-nonsense bun. When he sat at the head of the table, expecting to find a broken woman or a weeping victim, Tahlia turned around with a look that could have scorched the polish off his floors. "I'm not eating that," she said, her voice steady and sharp, cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. She pointed to the elaborate breakfast spread. "And I'm not sitting here waiting for you to decide when I'm allowed to exist." Kyung-min paused, his espresso cup halfway to his lips. His dark eyes tracked her movements with a predatory stillness. "The food is from the best kitchen in the city, Tahlia. It is a waste to let it go cold." "Then stop wasting it on me," she countered, stepping into his space. She didn't flinch when his shadow fell over her. "I don't want your chef. I want my sketchbook. I have a senior thesis due in 3 weeks, and if you think I'm going to let some back-alley execution ruin my GPA, you haven't been paying attention." A flicker of something amusement, or perhaps genuine surprise, passed over Kyung-min's stoic features. He was used to women who wanted his credit cards or his mercy. He wasn't used to a woman demanding her homework. "You are in the middle of a syndicate war," he reminded her, his voice a low rumble. "Design sketches seem trivial." "To you, maybe," she snapped, leaning over the table until she was inches from his face. "To me, they're my life. You've already taken my freedom and my phone. You will not take my future. If I'm going to be stuck in this museum of yours, I'm going to work. Get me my charcoal, my pads, and a sewing machine, or I'll start cutting up your $5. 0 curtains to make a pattern. Try me." For the first time since the alleyway, the monster of Manhattan truly looked at her, not as a witness to be managed, but as a firebrand he had accidentally invited into his home. He set his cup down slowly. He didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed. He realized then that Tahlia Monroe wasn't a trophy to be stored in a gilded cage. She was a storm he had tried to capture in a bottle. The library was the only room in the penthouse that didn't feel like it was made of cold glass and judgment. It was lined with dark mahogany and smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco, a sanctuary of shadows where the city lights couldn't quite reach. Tahlia was hunched over a heavy oak table, her charcoal pencil scratching frantically against a fresh pad, when she felt that familiar shift in the air. She didn't have to look up to know Kyung-min was standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His black dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and draped in intricate, dark ink. He walked toward the window, his movements silent and fluid, and poured a finger of amber liquid into a crystal glass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling against the reinforced glass 60 floors above the street. Tahlia's gaze drifted from her sketch to the tattoo snaking up the side of his neck, a jagged, geometric pattern that disappeared under his jawline. Up close, it didn't look like art, it looked like a map. "Which one was the first?" she asked softly. The question felt heavy in the quiet room. Kyung-min paused, the glass halfway to his lips. He turned his head slightly, the low light catching the sharp angle of his cheekbone. He didn't answer at first, but then he reached up, tracing the very edge of a faded, blurred line near his collarbone that looked different from the sharp, professional work covering the rest of his skin. "This one," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "I was 14. In Seoul, there is a district where the sun never seems to reach the alleys. My father had debts, and in my world, debts are inherited like eye color." He took a slow sip of the whiskey, his eyes fixed on some distant point in his memory. "It wasn't a mark of rank. It was a brand. A reminder that my life didn't belong to me anymore. I had to become a wolf just to stop the other wolves from eating me alive." Tahlia let her pencil rest. She saw the monster of Manhattan every day, but in the dim light of the library, she finally saw the boy who had survived the shadows. The tattoos weren't trophies of a life of crime. They were the armor he had grown to hide a heart that had been wounded long before he ever held a gun. "My mother used to say that scars are just proof that the past couldn't break you," she whispered. Kyung-min looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a fleeting second the cold mask of the syndicate boss slipped. He looked like a man who was tired of being a statue. "Your mother was a wise woman, Tahlia, but some scars are deeper than skin." He set his glass down and walked toward the door, leaving her alone with her sketches and the sudden, terrifying realization that the man keeping her captive was just as trapped as she was. The cabin fever finally broke Tahlia's resolve on a Tuesday afternoon when the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb of expensive air. Kyung-min was away at a logistics meeting, and the relative quiet of the estate felt like an opportunity. She didn't have much, just a pair of diamond earrings Kyung-min had left on her vanity as if they were common trinkets, but she knew their value was enough to buy a man's loyalty for an hour. She found the youngest guard, a man named Min-ho, stationed near the secondary service elevator. He looked barely older than her, his suit stiff and his eyes constantly scanning the monitors. Tahlia approached him with the calculated grace she had learned in her figure drawing classes, holding the diamonds out in her palm. They caught the light, throwing tiny, jagged rainbows against the white walls. "1 hour," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Just let me get to the subway. You can tell him I slipped past you while you were checking the perimeter. These will pay for a new life, Min-ho, far away from here." The young man looked at the gems, then at Tahlia, and for a second she saw the flicker of temptation. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, hollow pity. He didn't reach for the diamonds. Instead, he reached for his tablet and swiped through a series of encrypted feeds. He turned the screen toward her. The images were grainy, captured from the very streets Tahlia called home. She saw her favorite coffee shop, her apartment building, and the entrance to her university. In every frame, there were men, unfamiliar, sharp-eyed men in charcoal coats, waiting. One was holding a printed photograph of her in the red velvet dress. "They aren't looking for Kyung-min anymore," Min-ho said, his voice devoid of malice. "They're looking for the witness. The Philadelphia syndicate put a $500,000 bounty on your head the morning after the hit. If you walk out that door, you won't make it to the end of the block. He isn't keeping you here to hide his crime, Tahlia. He's keeping you here because you're the only target they can see." The earrings felt suddenly heavy, like lead in her hand. She looked back at the sprawling glass windows she had spent days rescenting. The city below, which had always represented her dreams and her future, now looked like a sea of predators waiting for her to drown. The protection she had dismissed as a mafia boss's power play was a cold, hard reality. She didn't try to bribe him again. She turned and walked back to her room, the silence of the penthouse no longer feeling like an insult, but a shield. For the first time, the gilded cage didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the only place on earth where she could still breathe. The dining room had been transformed into a theater of cold ambition. The long obsidian table was lined with men whose faces looked like they had been carved from the same hard granite as Kyung-min's resolve. These were the lieutenants of the syndicate, men who managed the flow of millions and the erasure of lives with the same clinical detachment. When Kyung-min entered with Tahlia at his side, the air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. Kyung-min didn't introduce her as a guest or a student. He placed her at the chair to his immediate right, a position usually reserved for a second-in-command. He wanted to show them his collection, to signal that what he protected was off-limits to their internal squabbles. Tahlia felt their eyes, heavy with judgment and a simmering, dangerous curiosity. To them, she was a liability in a red velvet history. A witness who should have been dealt with weeks ago. "The Philadelphia breach cost us 3 transit hubs," one of the older men, a grizzled veteran named June, stated as he slid a tablet toward the center of the table. "Our overhead for security in the garment district has tripled, yet our yields are down 15%. The numbers don't lie, Kyung-min. We are leaking from the inside." As the men argued over logistics and percentages, Tahlia's eyes drifted to the digital ledger on the screen. In fashion, a single misplaced stitch or a slight variation in dye lot could ruin an entire collection. She was trained to see the minute fractures in a pattern. While the men shouted about territory and muscle, Tahlia noticed a recurring line item for synthetic textiles, redirected to a warehouse in Queens. A warehouse she knew, from her own sourcing research, had been condemned for months. "The numbers might not lie," Tahlia said, her voice cutting through the masculine roar like a silk ribbon. The table went dead silent. June looked at her as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. She didn't wait for permission. She leaned forward, her finger hovering over the screen. But your bookkeeper does. You're reporting a 15% loss in the garment district, but you're billing for high-grade silk imports through a terminal that doesn't have a functional loading dock. You aren't losing that money to Philadelphia. Someone in this room is buying empty shipping containers and pocketing the difference. Kyung-min didn't move, but his gaze shifted from the ledger to the man sitting at the far end of the table, whose knuckles had suddenly turned white. The silence that followed was different than before. It was the silence of a predator who had just been shown exactly where the prey was hiding. Tahlia sat back, her pulse steady despite the lethal atmosphere. She wasn't a doll to be shown off or a victim to be shielded. She had found the flaw in their pattern, and as Kyung-min slowly turned his head toward her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, she realized she had earned a terrifying kind of respect. She was no longer just the witness, she was the architect of their exposure. The transition from the heated tension of the boardroom to the absolute void of a blackout happened in the space of a single heartbeat. One moment, the penthouse was a temple of cold light and digital ledgers. The next, the floor-to-ceiling windows were the only source of illumination, casting the skeletal shadows of the skyline across the room. The hum of the climate control died, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against Tahlia's eardrums. Kyung-min didn't shout. He didn't even stand up quickly. He simply reached out in the dark, his hand finding Tahlia's wrist with unerring accuracy. His skin was unnervingly cool. "The backup generators have been sabotaged," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that barely carried past her ear. "This isn't a grid failure, it's an invitation." The sound of shattering glass echoed from the far end of the gallery, followed by the muffled, rhythmic thud of boots on carpet. The professionals had arrived. Kyung-min pulled her close, his body a solid, unyielding heat against her back, as he drew a weapon she hadn't even realized he was carrying. "They'll be using thermal imaging," Kyung-min murmured, his tactical mind already dismantling the threat. "The main hallway is a kill zone. We need a way to the reinforced secondary suite without crossing the open floor." Tahlia felt a surge of adrenaline that sharpened her memory of the blueprints she'd stared at during her weeks of confinement. She had spent hours packing every inch of the estate, measuring the walls for her imagined design studio. She knew things the tactical teams wouldn't, the architectural quirks of a $50 million renovation. "The service corridor for the laundry chute," she whispered, her fingers curling around his sleeve. "It's hidden behind the mahogany paneling in the library. It's narrow, and it doesn't have vents. Their thermals won't see the heat signature through the reinforced insulation." In the pitch black, she led him. It was a strange inversion of power, the captive guiding the captor through his own fortress. Tahlia moved by touch, her hand trailing along the molding she had once critiqued for its lack of symmetry. Behind them, the sharp hiss of a suppressed muzzle flash lit the hallway like a strobe light, but they were already stepping into the cramped, cedar-scented dark of the hidden passage. As they moved through the narrow spine of the building, the air grew thin and hot. Kyung-min's hand never left hers. In the suffocating darkness, the titles of boss and witness vanished. They were simply two heartbeats in the dark, forced to rely on her memory and his lethality to see the sun again. For the first time, Tahlia realized that in this world of wolves, she wasn't just his liability, she was his only eyes. The secondary suite was a vault of cold steel and silence, but the air inside was thick with the copper tang of blood. Kyung-min slumped against the reinforced door, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. A stray round had found the gap in his tactical vest, blossoming into a dark, wet stain across his side. In the emergency dimness of the room, his face was the color of ash, the sharp lines of his features finally softening under the weight of a pain he couldn't outrun. Tahlia stood 5 feet away, her eyes locked on the keypad by the door. The secondary suite had its own independent exit, a service stairwell that led directly to the street. The code was taped to the underside of the desk, a detail she had memorized weeks ago. This was it. The chaos of the hit, the darkness, the wounded man, it was the perfect storm for an escape. She could be out of the building and lost in the Manhattan crowds before his men even cleared the hallway. She looked at the door, then back at Kyung-min. He was watching her, his hand pressed firmly against the wound, blood seeping through his fingers. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't command her to stay. He just looked at her with a quiet, exhausted resignation, as if he had already accepted that he was a monster not worth saving. Tahlia's hands shook as she moved, but she didn't move toward the door. She lunged for her work table, grabbing a pair of heavy professional fabric shears and a bolt of heavy, raw silk she had been using for a pattern. "What are you doing?" Kyung-min rasped, his eyes narrowing as she knelt in the pool of his shadow. "Shut up," she snapped, the firebrand returning to her voice. She used the shears to slice through his custom-tailored shirt with the same clinical precision she used on a muslin fitting. The wound was deep, a jagged tear that was stealing his life a teaspoon at a time. She didn't have a medical kit, but she had the tools of a creator. She folded the silk into a thick, sterile compress, using the strength of the weave to create a tension bandage. As she leaned her weight into the wound to stop the bleeding, Kyung-min let out a choked sound, his hand flying up to catch her shoulder, not to push her away, but to hold on. "You could have gone," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "Why didn't you go?" Tahlia didn't look up. She focused on the silk, now turning crimson in her hands. "Because I'm a designer, Kyung-min, I don't leave things unfinished, and I don't let people bleed out on my floor." In that moment, as she tied the silk tight, the bridge between them was no longer built on fear or possession. It was built on a human choice. She had traded her freedom for his life, and as he finally closed his eyes, his head resting against her shoulder, the monster of Manhattan felt a lot like a man who was finally being seen. The silence following the failed assassination attempt didn't last long. It was replaced by the shrill, persistent ringing of a burner phone Kyung-min kept in the suite's wall safe. He was still pale, leaning against the headboard of the bed where Tahlia had finished dressing his wound. But the moment he answered the call, his eyes turned back into the cold, black flint of the monster of Manhattan. He didn't speak. He listened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the device. Then he tapped a button and set the phone on the silk sheets between them. A woman's sob, jagged and terrified, filled the small space. "Tahlia, please." Tahlia's heart stopped. It was Maya, her roommate and best friend, the only person who had been calling her nonstop since she vanished. The voice on the other end shifted to a man's, low and distorted by a modulator. "The girl is a chatterbox, Kyung-min. She tells us Tahlia was working on a collection inspired by the void. Well, we're happy to let her join that void unless you vacate the Brooklyn docks by midnight. No police, no soldiers, just the witness for the girl, or we kill them both and take the docks anyway." The line went dead. Tahlia felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her. Maya was innocent. She was the girl who stayed up late helping Tahlia pin hemlines and shared cheap ramen in their cramped apartment. She wasn't part of this world of ink and lead. Tahlia looked at Kyung-min. The Brooklyn docks were the crown jewel of his empire, the primary artery for every shipment that sustained his syndicate. Giving them up wasn't just a financial loss. It was a surrender that would signal his weakness to every shark in the city. It was 15 years of blood and bone, traded for a girl who had stumbled into his life by mistake. "You can't do it," Tahlia whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll kill you if you lose the docks. Your own men will turn on you." Kyung-min looked at the blood-stained silk bandage she had wrapped around his side, the silk she had chosen to use on him instead of running for her life. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than his anger. "For 15 years, I thought the docks were the only thing that made me a king," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I thought power was what you owned." He stood up, wincing as the wound pulled, but his gaze remained steady. "But a king without a soul is just a ghost in a suit. They think they found my weakness, Tahlia. They don't realize they just gave me a reason to burn the whole city down." He didn't call his lieutenants. He didn't check his ledgers. He simply grabbed his jacket and checked the clip in his pistol. He was choosing the woman who had looked him in the eye and seen a man instead of a monster, even if it meant losing everything he had ever built. The Brooklyn docks were a skeletal forest of rusted cranes and shipping containers, shivering under the same relentless Manhattan rain that had seen them meet. The air was thick with the smell of salt and old diesel, the neon lights of the distant skyline fractured into jagged, colorful shards on the oily puddles. This time, however, the silence wasn't atmospheric, it was tactical. Kyung-min moved through the shadows like a ghost made of ink, his silhouette cutting through the mist with lethal intent. Beside him, Tahlia didn't tremble. She wore a dark trench coat over her work clothes, her hand gripping the heavy industrial flashlight she had pulled from the SUV. She wasn't the girl in the red velvet dress anymore. She was a participant in a high-stakes design where the only outcome was survival. The rival boss, a man named Vance who radiated a greasy, unearned confidence, stood in the center of a pier, holding Maya by the arm. A dozen armed men flanked him, their weapons trained on the single path forward. "You're late, Kyung-min," Vance shouted over the roar of the wind. "I expected a man who loved his empire to move a little faster. Where's the witness?" Kyung-min stepped into the light, alone and seemingly unarmed, his hands raised. "I'm here, and the girl is close, but you've made a mistake, Vance. You looked at my ledgers, but you didn't look at the map." That was the signal. Tahlia, positioned high above on a gantry crane she had identified as the blind spot in Vance's perimeter, clicked the high-intensity strobe light. The beam didn't just illuminate the pier. It shattered the darkness into a disorienting, rhythmic pulse of blinding white light. It was a visual overload, a glitch in the environment that turned the professional killers into panicked amateurs. As Vance's men shielded their eyes, Kyung-min moved. He was a blur of motion, the speed of his strike born from years of survival. Before the first muzzle flash could light the air, he had closed the gap. Tahlia didn't look away. She kept the light pinned on the center of the chaos, her hands steady as the sound of gunfire echoed off the metal containers. Within seconds, the power dynamic shifted. Vance was on the ground, the cold steel of Kyung-min's pistol pressed against his temple, while Maya scrambled toward the safety of the shadows. Kyung-min didn't pull the trigger immediately. He looked up at the crane, meeting Talia's gaze through the rain and the strobe light. In that regard, there was no boss and no witness. There was only the recognition of a partner. She had provided the distraction, the flaw in the enemy's pattern that allowed him to finish the work. The rain continued to fall, but the shadows were no longer a place of fear. They were a place where, together, they had finally taken back control of their own story. The transition from the docks to the future was not marked by a sudden disappearance of the shadows, but by a choice to finally step out of them. A year later, the rain still fell on Manhattan, but Tahlia Monroe no longer saw it as a veil for violence. She stood in a bright, loft-style studio in the garment district, the air filled with the whir of sewing machines and the scent of fresh cedar rather than gunpowder. On the wall hung a framed degree from Columbia, but beside it was something more meaningful. The first sketch she had ever made in the library of a penthouse, a drawing of a man's silhouette that saw past the monster and found the human underneath. Kyung-min stood by the window, but he wasn't watching the door like a predator. He was looking at a set of blueprints for a new community center, a legitimate venture that didn't require a gun to protect. The ink on his neck was still there, a map of where he had been, but it no longer defined where he was going. He had learned that power wasn't found in the number of docks he owned or the fear he commanded. It was found in the moment he allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to be saved by a girl in a ruined red dress. This journey reminds us that vulnerability is the ultimate form of courage. It takes a certain kind of strength to destroy, but it takes a far greater power to build something new from the wreckage of a broken past. We often think we can keep what we value through force, but as Kyung-min discovered, you can only truly keep someone through trust. You cannot cage a heart and expect it to beat for you. You have to earn the right to stand beside it. The most dangerous people in our world are often just those who have been conditioned to survive by any means necessary. And sometimes, one person's unwavering belief in their humanity is the only catalyst needed for a total transformation. Tahlia turned a wrong corner and found a new life, while Kyung-min found the only reason he ever needed to finally put the gun down. Their story is a testament to the fact that our mistakes don't have to be our endings. They can be the unplanned beginnings of the life we were always meant to live. If you enjoyed this journey of redemption, comment, witness, below and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that light can be found in even the darkest places. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.